I'm Elizabeth Hoover. I am an associate professor in the Environmental Science Policy Management Department at UC Berkeley. The first book that I wrote was called The River is in Us, Fighting Toxics in a Mohawk Community, that focuses on environmental health research that the community did with field workers from the community. While I was there, I started volunteering with this group called Ganahio Yungoya Dohage, or We Are Planting Good Seeds, working to get people back into farming and gardening and seed saving and eating local produce. That led me to wonder, how are other community-based organizations in other tribal communities doing this work? So I started attending these different food sovereignty summits that have been popping up over the last decade or so. Traveled 20,000 miles around the country and went to 40 different communities and asked people, what are some of the successes and challenges that you're having and facing? How are you defining food sovereignty for your community? How do you center control over a food system with the food producers and the consumers, as opposed to these multinational corporations who really control the food systems now? And how do you prevent that environment from becoming contaminated through other people's bad ideas? The reason why there's such a push now and a movement to reclaim food sovereignty is because the settler colonial system here has intentionally targeted Indigenous food systems for destruction for the purposes of political domination. You go from a diet of a lot of meats, vegetables, berries, fruits, to not being fed enough and being fed foods that were very different. And it's not like people had a lot of time to pack up all of their seeds and their materials. People were rounded up and forced on a death march. People got to a new space, to a very different landscape, and not having their tools and their seeds with them. And so again, had to adapt to what foods were available, what foods were given to them, and are now having to consciously work to reclaim these seed varieties and these kinds of foods. Working to reclaim health is a very political act when the health of your community has been intentionally targeted for destruction. So taking those ideas around control over food and agriculture systems, how do we instead localize food systems so that they all look a little different and are controlled by the local communities and are reliant on foods that will do well in those local spaces? How do you remedy health through taking control over these food systems? Wild rice is a really important foodstuff for Indigenous people in the Great Lakes area. For people who go out and gather this wild rice, who take their canoes and their knockers, these two big sticks, and go out and they bend the heads of the rice over and tap it, and somebody in the back of the canoe will kind of push the canoe along. So it's a particular skill that's passed down, through communities, through families. And along the way, you have all of these specialists who are making their living for the year. When tribal nations signed treaties with the United States, it was often with the understanding that people would still have the right, ensured through law, to gather traditional foods in these spaces. And those rights are being threatened by the potential of those spaces becoming contaminated. It's a really sensitive plant. It requires a certain amount of very clean water, and so if those waterways are contaminated, that plant dies, and it's very hard to bring it back. It's really difficult to reclaim chemical pollution or oil or other petrochemicals. Pipelines are being touted as a more efficient way to get oil to places where that oil is then refined and often shipped to other places around the world. The concerns is that pipelines leak. It's not like, if this pipeline leaks, it's when and where it's going to leak. And you have to decide whose property do you put a pipeline over. And so companies feel that they can route these pipelines through these spaces that are blank on maps and left intentionally blank on maps. It's like, here's all this empty space up here. We're just going to run the pipeline over the space that looks very empty on the map, but which on the ground is a very important habitat for wild rice, and where Native communities are out in spaces insured through treaties gathering food. Leaving something blank can be an act of cartographic violence, right? Deciding what goes onto the paper and is deemed as worthy of being mapped and what spaces get left blank. To the outside viewer, it's like, oh, it's a map. It's very objective, right? This is just showing me where things are. But a lot of power goes into deciding what is put on that map, what is brought attention to, what is deemed as worthy of mapping out there. A big part of the activism of these Indigenous water protectors and allies has been to make very visible to the public, what does it look like when a big scar is cut through the earth to put these pipelines in? What does it look like after they're leaking? What does it look like when people go to resist those and are then pepper sprayed and beat up by the police? It has taken Indigenous leadership, but also other allied communities that recognize that these are terrible projects and are not worth permanent environmental destruction. When it comes to how does the architectural community figure out how to be better allies, there's not going to be one big be an ally to the world answer. It's going to be, what do the communities in your region want and need? And it's going to look a little different in every different place depending on the communities there and the settler colonial history that those communities have had to navigate and face and rebound from. Allyship is important. Allyship that follows Indigenous leadership is even more important, and that takes as many numbers as possible.